Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Paris Air Forum. I'm John Strickland, and delighted to be here moderating this session this afternoon with Willie Walsh, Director General of IATA. So, Willie, welcome to Paris, and welcome to Paris Air Forum.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here. Bonjour. That's all the French you'll get from me today.
We could have a few Irish songs, I think, later on, after a few Guinnesses. So, Willie, I think we haven't actually met for about 3 years. And, of course, the last time we would have met, you would have been heading up IAG. You'd announced your plans to leave the industry and retire. And then the world changed completely. You haven't retired, but a lot has happened in the industry. You've been in IATA now for, is it just over a year? And a very eventful year. I mean, the COVID pandemic had begun. What's your kind of take broadly on having moved into IATA at such a difficult time?
Well, I suppose the good news is things are significantly improving. You know, it's no doubt that 2020, 2021 were the two worst years in our industry's history by any measure. And it's pleasing to see that we're making good progress this year. So I'm actually quite optimistic. You know, there are challenges, and I'm sure we'll talk about them. But I'm optimistic for the outlook for this year and going into next year as well.
Well, when the crisis hit, I think many airlines thought they'd planned for tough crises before, perhaps 9/11 being the reference point. But COVID really has been something else. I'm sure that neither of us imagined we'd see the industry almost entirely grounded, you know, for long periods of time, and carnage really all over the place. But although we're wrestling with an outside force in terms of a pandemic, as a species, so to speak, we haven't really helped ourselves, have we, in terms of the way that governments have responded? There's been a lack of coherence and a great deal of confusion in the way they've applied their regulations to the airline business.
Yeah, very, very disappointing, and unfortunately continues. I was in Seville at the weekend, flying on a Spanish-registered aircraft, so you have to wear a mask. You know, flying to Seville wearing a mask, flying back from Seville on a UK-registered aircraft where you don't wear a mask. So people are sort of saying, what's all this about? It is a challenging time. You mentioned 2001. In fact, people often ask me, how does this relate back to what we suffered in 2001 or 2009? And the way I look at it, you can look at it in many different ways, but in 2001, if you look at the post-9/11 events and what happened in 2002 revenues were 6.4% lower than 2001. Now, at the time, for many airlines, particularly those exposed to the transatlantic, that was a crisis beyond anything they'd seen before. If you roll forward, you know, we then had SARS and the impact that had. But if you roll forward to 2008, 2009, in 2009, after Lehman's collapsed in September 2008, the revenues for the industry fell by 16.5%. So 6.4% in 2002, 16.5% in 2009. And then you look at 2020, revenues in the industry were down 56%. In 2020 versus 2019. So by any measure, and you can look at it in lots of different ways, you know, passenger numbers were down about 60%. Actually, in 2009, despite the revenues being down 16.5%, passenger numbers were the same. So this is a crisis beyond anything we've seen before. It's much deeper, it's prolonged, and you know, we are seeing recovery, but it also is a crisis that demonstrated that, you know, the world actually isn't a single coordinated place when it comes to aviation. Yes, we have safety regulation that's pretty much the same everywhere, but when it came to dealing with this pandemic, every country went their own way. And disappointing for me, you know, even the EU, where you would have expected a collective response, we didn't see it. You know, we saw each of the 27 countries, in effect, adopting their own measures. And some continue to do so today, despite EASA saying that masks are no longer mandatory. We still have, I think, 12 countries in Europe. It may be reducing now, actually, because I think some changed over the weekend, maintaining a mask mandate. So I think the thing that really did disappoint us in the industry is the way we saw so many different responses to the same problem. And let's be honest, none of them worked. They were all failures. You know, we had restrictions imposed on the industry that achieved nothing. All of the analysis we've done, and many others have done it, has shown that these border closures were of no value. It didn't reduce the number of people infected. It didn't reduce the peak. If anything, it may have bought a couple of days, possibly a couple of weeks. But it certainly wasn't the answer to the challenge that governments faced as a result of this pandemic, and terrible economic damage done to the industry and to economies all around the world.
And with that very, very fragmented response that you talk about, Willie, there, you would have been, well, indeed, you were still at the IAG when the crisis hit. As an individual airline CEO, there's probably a degree of helplessness when you're flying across borders, and one airline can't influence maybe their own government, never mind governments all over the world. But with IATA being a global body and representing broadly the airline industry, do you feel you've been able to make any progress against this swathe of government inconsistency, and we'll be able to do so as we now maybe let the dust settle on this?
Yeah, I think we are making some progress. I think one of the mistakes we made as an industry is that we were too sympathetic to governments when this first happened. When I was at IAG, we actually considered taking a legal case against the UK government because we felt that the measures that they imposed were done without proper process. So, we started legal proceedings with a view to challenging the government in court. We were pushed quite hard by the government not to do so. They gave us commitments that, they would respond positively to the points that we were making, which of course they didn't do. So if I look back on it, I think a mistake that we made was that we didn't actually challenge harder and sooner some of the measures, because many of these measures were done without scientific evidence to support them. And although governments said they were being, driven by the science, it was political science that was driving them. It wasn't medical science. So I think we have to ensure that lessons have been learned from this pandemic, because there will be another one. The global pandemic was on every airline's risk register. And we had debated the impact of a global pandemic for many years. I think the thing that took all of us by surprise was that the world shut down, that borders were closed everywhere. That's not something that I had anticipated. So I think we must learn, everybody must learn from this. We now have a lot of data that we can use to demonstrate what was done well and what was done badly. And I think next time round, we need to be much stronger, more united, more determined as an industry to ensure that we don't suffer these measures again. Because as I said, the measures that were taken by most, if not all, governments were ineffective in terms of dealing with the pandemic.
And do you think there's any way is any forum where you can get multiple governments sitting down together and try to come up with like a checklist or any performances at the UN or the EU, describe the EU's failure as a political body there, anything that could make people sit down and really do like a wash-up, so to speak, on this? Yeah,
I think there will be several elements of wash-up being done. But don't forget, we have the WHO, and the WHO from the very beginning, who are the experts in this. They are the medical experts.
Yes.
They deal with these issues. And they were very clear. They said, don't close your borders. From the very beginning, they said border closures are ineffective. And in fact, in many cases, they said will be counterproductive. So, and the WHO, I think, continue to recommend that throughout. So we do have medical expertise that we can, call on and look back on. The problem was nobody listened to them because, it changed from individual governments thinking, I've got to take control here. And it was being done to a large degree on the basis of political concerns. What will the electorate think of how I handle this? You look at the UK, Boris Johnson, he highlights one of the reasons why he should continue to be Prime Minister as being the way he handled the pandemic. What a joke. What was it, 175,000 people died in the UK, and that's something that he wants to celebrate, on the basis that it could have been worse. They should have done a hell of a lot better. The reality of it is, in many countries, health systems weren't prepared, despite the fact that they would have had pandemic on their risk register. Countries didn't have the equipment in place. You look at the scramble to find PPE, the billions that were wasted buying PPE that was ineffective because nobody knew. They were just buying anything they could get. So, we have to do better next time round. And The problem with politicians is their memories tend to be very short, and there tends to be, significant change in politics. But we as an industry must remind the politicians as to, what they should have done, what they did, and what they shouldn't do going forward.
Well, if anything, of course, now we're seeing there's much used phrase of pent-up demand. In evidence now, demand is coming back where people can fly. If that's not a lesson to politicians about the industry, I don't know what is, because the public's voting with their feet, with their wallets, and wanted to get back and fly. So we're seeing many important markets in the world opening up, not least, as you mentioned, but the transatlantic market is a major one for a lot of airlines here in Europe and the US. Some flights to Asia, although not so many, and within Europe, of course, again, many European flows. What about Asia specifically, and China, of course, because China is where the virus began, and initially they were being, as a country, applauded because of the strength of their domestic market. That grew and came back, even though they closed external borders. But now, with lockdowns happening in many major Chinese cities, the whole market seems to have softened up, and that's got major ramifications, of course, for the industry more widely. What is your feeling about that?
Yeah, there's little evidence to suggest China will open. They're beginning to relax things in Beijing. They are pursuing zero COVID in the belief that that's the right solution for them. China is an important market. If you look back to 2019, the domestic Chinese market represented just under 10% of all aviation globally. So a huge domestic market, and you quite rightly say it had recovered strongly, but has suffered recently then with the local lockdowns or the regional lockdowns that they put in place in China. And probably another way to look at it is if we look at international travel within Asia. In 2019, that was about 13% of all international travel globally. So one of the biggest markets in the world. In 2021, last year, that was 1.5%, so practically non-existent. And the Asian traffic is lagging significantly behind other parts of the world. Asia traffic for the Asian carriers, international traffic, was at 7% in 2021. When we look at traffic from Asia to the rest of the world, 7% of where it was in 2019. First quarter this year was up to 13%. So it's creeping up. And we are seeing several countries in the region now relax their restriction, particularly for vaccinated customers. But China and Hong Kong, although some of the restrictions have been eased, they're still not going to be sufficiently reduced to encourage people to travel there. So I think those markets look like they are going to suffer for some time. It's not a huge problem for the industry this year because there's plenty of other markets that are recovering. So as airlines start to ramp up their activity, I don't think we're overly dependent on a recovery in the Chinese market. Where it will be more of an issue will be if China continues to be locked down in 2023. Then I think you will start to see it. Now, it has impacted on some airlines like Finnair, for example. Yeah. Who have been hit hard, with the closure of Russian airspace, but also the importance of the Asian market to them, their strategy to grow their network into Asia has clearly suffered significantly as a result of what we've seen over the last 2 years, and more recently with the closure of Russian airspace.
And airlines like Cathay Pacific, who is always seen as a stalwart of Asia, well-run, profitable.
Yeah. Well, Hong Kong as a hub is gone now. It's decimated. Yeah. They're going to have to work very hard to recover their position. If you're Hong Kong Airport, fantastic airport, great hub carrier, Cathay. And for a hub to be effective, to have a global hub, you need a strong hub carrier, and you need a strong airport, and you need a good relationship between the two. So I would imagine both Cathay and Hong Kong International Airport will be looking to recover their network, but it's going to take a long time and a lot of work. It doesn't automatically come back, as we've seen in other parts of the world. You have to work hard to rebuild your network. And as they're still effectively closed, you've got other major hub airports in the region and elsewhere rebuilding quickly. So it's going to be a real challenge for them.
Absolutely. Now, in terms of airlines getting through this, maybe we would have all expected perhaps more failures during this time, but perhaps not been as many as you might have imagined on the face of it. We've seen in some cases, government money has gone in, either supporting airlines that already have a partial or whole state ownership, or indirectly in things like furlough schemes. Others have had to stand completely on their own 2 feet. But whatever has happened, and particularly for private companies, we now have enormous debt levels. Airlines have had to go out to shareholders, to the markets and raise money. Is that going to be a shackle that it could actually bring down more companies in the short to medium term, or is it one that's just going to be a lead weight for years ahead?
I think it continues to be a challenge when you look at the other issues that we're facing at the moment, such as the high oil price. Now, we've seen high oil prices before, and I'll comment on that in a moment, but the debt that airlines have taken on has been very significant, over 200 billion additional US dollars additional debt, and increasing as airlines continue to try and strengthen their balance sheet. So I think it's certainly going to be a challenge for most airlines to repair their balance sheet. Every airline, with the exception of the all-cargo airlines, were heavily impacted. It was just the degree to which they were impacted that you have to debate. So I think you'll see a more cautious industry in the short term until balance sheets get repaired a little bit. But you do have to give credit to airline management teams around the world. We estimated that 85 airlines failed if you look at 2020 and 21. Significantly less than we had expected. Most of these were small or relatively small and in weak financial state before the pandemic. In fact, some of them I think would have failed anyway.
Yes.
But you look at what's happening at the moment. We see jet fuel, shy of about $1,300 a barrel. But interesting, I was just looking back in 2008. So in May this time, the end of May 2008, jet fuel was $1,274 a barrel. A ton, 1,274 a ton. It's roughly the same at the end of May this year. So we've seen these high oil prices before.
Yeah.
And we know how to deal with high oil prices because it impacts just about everybody. But I think for weaker airlines, the combination of weak balance sheets and this high oil price represents a challenge to them as you go into the latter part of this year and the early part of next year, when we are likely to see demand ease off as we would normally see in the winter period. So I don't think every airline is out of the woods yet, and that's why I would expect airline management teams to be cautious as we go through this year, build up their cash reserves to ensure that they have sufficient liquidity to see through the winter period. And obviously, to be prepared in case there's any additional challenges that come their way.
Yeah. And we'll talk about some of the other big challenges which exist in a minute, Willie, but linked to coming out of this pandemic, I mentioned pent-up demand. We have been seeing sporadically some strong routes late last year on the transatlantic and in Europe and over Christmas until Omicron came along. We're really seeing it now, spring and summer. And I think most airlines I look at reporting are talking about very high levels of bookings, even in some ways, to my surprise, pretty good mix on the ticket prices too, the yields they're seeing. But what the industry is getting slated about right now in the media is flight cancellations and delays. We're seeing manpower complications, be it on the airline or the airport side. It seems partially demand has come back just so quick, and with the government regulations that were so unclear that we talked about, airlines have been caught out. It seems to me unavoidably, but the media is suggesting, well, airlines should have ramped up monthly. They should have known this was coming. Because it's not that simple, is it?
No, it's not. Like we take the UK, where there's been a lot of focus, and it's not helped that you have an idiot as a transport minister, who doesn't know what he's talking about. But if you look at the UK stopped their financial support, their furlough scheme at the end of September of last year. So you look at a decision that was taken, prior to September. The belief was, that's it, everything's fine, we're going in the right direction. Passenger numbers in the UK in the fourth quarter of last year, when there was no government support for airlines, zero government support for airlines, passenger numbers were down 55% versus 2019. Now, the idea that an airline would start ramping up when their traffic levels are at minus 55%, they're still burning through cash. and you have a government that is changing their mind by the day. So in other words, if you look back what happened in November, the UK government took all of the countries off their famous red list. They put them back, 13 of them back on in late November with the Omicron. They were removing restrictions, introducing restrictions. So the idea that airlines would suddenly say, oh, we're out of this, let's start recruiting again, when you had no idea what the government was going to do, is a nonsense. You know, first quarter of this year, passenger traffic in the UK was down 42%. You know, in April, it's still down by 30, I think it was 34%. You know, and so you have a politician saying airlines should have ramped up sooner. No, they shouldn't. Airlines would have gone out of business had they done what these idiot politicians are saying they should have done. And I think we also have to put it into context that it's not every airport in the world that has a problem, and it's not every airline that has a problem. And, you know, if I had £1 for every newspaper headline that said airport chaos during my career, I'd be an extremely rich man, because we had these problems before this as well. It's not unusual to have problems in our industry. You go back to 2019, we were suffering from air traffic control problems, strikes in France in particular that were leading to multiple cancellations. So, you know, we've had these headlines before. I think there is a bit of hysteria at the moment, and I think we do need to put it into context. Yes, we have some challenges, but these are challenges that we will deal with, and actually in a strange way, they're good challenges for the industry, because what it shows is demand is strong, we are rebuilding, we will repair the damage, and, you know, we'll get this right. But, you know, a politician thinking that an airline should be ready for 100%, when only a few months ago it was still...
There was nothing happening.
There was nothing. And you know, no guarantee that these people wouldn't change their mind again. So I have great sympathy for airline management teams. You know, I'm almost at the point, and this is where I think I should leave, but I'm almost at the point where I'm having sympathy for airports. So, you know, you know, I think we need, you know, those of us who understand what's going on need to call out these politicians and remind them of what they did, the damage that they did, and you know, point out the fools that they are. So, you know, it is important, as I said, that we put this into context and not get drawn in to creating a problem that really isn't one for every airline and every airport.
In terms of, I mean, a lot of jobs in aviation have long been low-paid jobs and quite demanding jobs on the front line, be it, you know, baggage loading and customer service jobs, whether it's on the ground or in the air facing customers. And I mean, it's how I began my own career. I know what it is to stand there at 6 a.m. and somebody shouting at you because the flight's delayed, and you can handle it once in a while. But if it becomes a regular thing every day, day in, day out, and your pay's not great, and we're now in a tight labour market, and we hear stories from, certainly in the UK, people are going off to work in supermarket checkouts or driving supermarket delivery vans just because they can get similar pay without the hassle. What do you feel about the future of, you know, the very high volume jobs that are needed to support the industry? Do you think there will be a need to change the approach? I was just before letting you answer, I was reading at IATA, you're launching a new training incentive, I think particularly on the handling side of the business, recognising that more thought does need to be given to this about career progress for people.
Yeah, it is a tough job. You know, I've loaded bags onto airplanes as well. You know, it's not something I would want to do every day of my working life. You know, we know it's tough, but there are still lots of people who like to do it, and it is a great industry. It's a challenging, exciting industry that's gone through a very difficult time. I heard again. I was in London yesterday, and I was listening to the radio where they're talking about nurses leaving the NHS to join airlines as cabin crew. So, you know, the NHS are blaming the airlines. So it can't be all that bad. You know, I think, as I said, these problems will be overcome. It is an opportunity for airlines to look at how they work and to see, is there a better way, a different way of doing it. And there's, you know, there is always a different way, and I think there's always a better way. There's always a new opportunity. I think we have to embrace technology, particularly in customer-facing areas. You know, we've talked about self-service check-in and self-service boarding. The equipment is there. You know, we just need to get back to digital solutions that will enable customers to look after themselves better. You know, the below the wing will always be a manual activity. We've seen technology introduced there. I think there are some things that can be done. You know, autonomous air bridges. We've seen you know, pushback vehicles, autonomous pushback vehicles. So there are changes that can be done. But in many areas, I've seen the technology actually increase the number of people you need rather than reduce the number of people you need. But you know, there will be solutions. So I think we've got to be optimistic again. These are, as I would say, business as usual challenges for airline management teams. And it gives an opportunity to do things in a different way. But you know, we should be positive about the outlook for the industry and positive about the nature of our industry, which I continue to think is one of the most exciting industries you'll ever find.
Oh, absolutely. Well, one of the big challenges which is there, which we would obviously all hope not to have, as we are hopefully coming out of COVID, is now the Ukraine situation, the war in Ukraine. Many people, of course, hoped it wasn't going to happen, and we perhaps wouldn't have imagined we'd be 3 or 4 months in, and still now we have no idea how this is going to be ever brought to hopefully a peaceful end. That again has been a big dent on airlines in general. We have the overflight issue for many airlines who would fly across Siberia to Asia. We have, of course, Russian airlines, many of whom would be IATA members who can't fly around the world. We have complications with leased aircraft and so on. What is your feeling about how that's going to play out? Because we haven't seen a war of this magnitude close to hand in Europe since the Second World War either.
Well, we've had conflict in the former Yugoslavia,
yes,
which you know, clearly again another tragic event. And you know, what we're seeing in Ukraine is awful. You know, and we have to condemn Russia for what's going on there. I think the challenge that it's created is manageable by the industry. Going back to what I said, traffic to Asia is actually very low at the moment. So the closure of Russian airspace is not having a major problem. It is clearly for some airlines like Finnair because of their geographic location. But for a lot of airlines, you know, it's adding to time and adding to fuel and adding to cost. But they're still able to operate to Asia. And the volume of flights, they're at low levels. So, you know, the impact that it's had on global aviation has been limited to countries around Ukraine, clearly Ukraine and near Ukraine. Russia itself, not a big international market. In fact, the Russian domestic market was one of the fastest
success story, wasn't
it? Yeah, in fact, from memory, I think in 2021 it was about 25% ahead of where it was in 2019. From some of the data we have, and we don't have a lot of visibility around that, it seems to be continuing to be strong as a domestic market, but there's very little international. Yes. We do have some airlines continuing to fly into Russia to serve the market. So I think this is going to continue for some time and clearly represents or will represent an additional challenge. But the real impact that it's had clearly has been on the price of oil. So, you know, as I said, we've seen jet back up to the levels that we'd seen in 2008 when we had seen the previous peak. If you remember in May, June of 2008, Brent was close to $150 a barrel. So as I said, we've seen these issues before. What it will mean is ticket prices have to go up. You know, if I look at the 10-year period, 2010 to 2019, which is probably the best 10-year period the industry had, and representative of what you would call a normal period, Brent averaged $80 a barrel. And it represented 27% of the industry's cost base. So this year Brent is averaging around $107 a barrel, I think. So you can see it's going to add 10%, 12% to the cost base. That will find its way through to fares. So you mentioned yields are high. I think part of the reason yields are high, not the only reason, because supply and demand is the biggest factor.
Tight capacity still.
But you know, you will see airlines having to reflect the higher oil price in ticket prices. It's inevitable. You know, given the financial state of these airlines, there's no way that they can absorb this additional cost. So unfortunately, this will find its way to consumers. That will have an impact on demand going forward. It's not, or doesn't appear to be having an impact at the moment, because I think there's a lot of that pent-up demand that is being you know, witnessed and fulfilled at the moment. But if it continues at these high levels, I think it will have, a demand at the margin for some airlines going into 2023.
Well, I think with that in mind, and also the pressures on consumers who themselves are suffering, stretches on their income, whether it is they're filling up their car with petrol or paying the fuel bills, or the cost of groceries with fuel behind that, I guess sensible airline management and focused airline management has got to look, as you say, beyond what looks like for many will be a very good summer, a very strong summer, but be ready, not be in any way complacent, ready for winter, which normally is poor anyway. And who knows what next year brings in terms of the economic landscape at the moment.
Yeah, and that's why I say I think you'll see airline management teams being more cautious.
Yeah.
I think it would be reasonable to expect them to be looking at the potential downside as much as the potential upside, and looking at the flexibility that they will have to reduce capacity or taper capacity in the event that high oil prices continue and demand starts easing off. But everything we've seen, interestingly, suggests that it's not going to have a long-term impact. Despite these headwinds that we're seeing, high inflation, high oil prices, the impact on consumers, consumers still want to travel.
Yeah.
And that's the great thing. I think one of the fears we all had back when this started is, would this deter forever people getting back into the air? And it hasn't. And that's the positive. We now know that once travel restrictions, border closures are relaxed or removed, people will travel. And, I think the outlook still remains positive. We'll give an update at the IATA AGM in Doha in a couple of weeks. So our new chief economist will be updating. But speaking to her, she still sees the positives and negatives more or less offsetting themselves. Right. It'll have we've all seen the outlook for global GDP being pulled back a little bit, but still positive. Caution is what I would expect to see, but I don't think you'll see any panic from airline management teams around the world.
Okay. And in terms of the shape of the industry, Willie, do you think this, you talked about in terms of the staff side of things, airline management's looking at how they run the businesses, the shape of the industry, type of business models and a number of airlines around, do you think this is also a catalyst, or these events a catalyst for more consolidation and shifting business models? If I think back to your previous position, IAG was born as an airline. I think you described it as being a consolidator in industry, and that's what you did in acquisitions, for example, with Aer Lingus, Vueling and so on. Do you think there's going to be more scope to do that and get the industry into a more lean and less fragmented shape?
Yeah, I think there will be M&A opportunities like we see in Latin America, where they're merging, where there's evidence of reasonable strength within the airlines, but clearly a demonstration that if they were to consolidate, it would be better for them. You see in the US, consolidation. The US balance sheets there are much healthier because the US airlines got a lot of financial support. You've got to give credit to the administration there. They recognize the economic importance, the strategic importance for the airline industry, and move very quickly to support them. So, the fight over Spirit is an interesting one to watch at the moment. But I think if I look elsewhere, I think there is opportunities for consolidation. But if I was CEO looking at my balance sheet, would I be prepared to take a risk on acquiring another airline, spending my precious cash to acquire one? You'd want to be really sure about it. Really sure that that's going to be a positive development. So you may see some mergers, all share mergers. I think I'm less optimistic about seeing an outright acquisition for cash being made, but wrong in the past, so I've no doubt I'll be wrong again on this. But I think there will be some consolidation, yeah.
And we do see interesting things now around in Europe, like what's going to happen with the Alitalia successor ITA, whether Lufthansa is going to dive in there, or maybe even Air France KLM. I'll have to ask Ben Smith later on. But
well, you have to wonder, so Air France made a bid, KLM made a bid, cost them both a lot of money over the years. But I suppose it is a different airline now. ITA is not Alitalia, and I think some of the fundamental issues that existed at Alitalia have now been addressed finally. So it's a very different opportunity today than it was when you looked at Lufthansa or Air France or KLM, or indeed when I was at both BA and IAG, we also looked at it. But we weren't brave enough or foolish enough to actually do anything.
For it. Yeah. Interesting. And what about business models? I mean, there are those who really do take opportunities out of a crisis. If we look particularly at Wizz Air and Ryanair, they're growing massively, not by acquisition, although there have been rumours about Wizz possibly being interested to acquire EasyJet. EasyJet itself has built up a war chest. Do you think the low-cost guys are still going to be ever growing in their importance, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's no one business model that's right. You can have multiple business models that can be successful. I think if you look at Europe, the airlines that have recovered fast have been Ryanair and Wizz, and have done well. Not without their problems as well, and both of them were heavily impacted by the downturn. But clearly, they were in good financial shape coming into this crisis. We know Wizz and EasyJet have been talking to one another for years. There's been rumours around potential deals there for some considerable time. So I've no surprise there. And again, I think there will be further consolidation within Europe. There's scope for it. So it's going to be an interesting one to watch. But you've heard Michael O'Leary in the past say, why should he spend money to acquire a weak airline other than for a slot position at an airport, when he can just take them
grow himself.
Yeah, he can
put pressure on the weaklings.
He can do it organically and allow the weak to fail. And when the weak fail, there's plenty of airlines that are in a good position to move in and serve the market. So consumers won't lose out. And we've seen that. Many times. You look at the collapse of Spanair in Barcelona. Vueling just moved in overnight. You look at the collapse of Malev. The market, was addressed almost immediately. So, I think there's opportunities for some consolidation, but we've always said the best consolidation you will get is when the weak fail
disappear,
and the strong fill the gaps that are left.
And the mix of traffic, Willie, again, just thinking back to your days at IAG and even much further back my own time at BA, the heady days of routes like some of the transatlantics, London, New York, with cabins full of nice, hefty club class yields. Obviously, that's heavily dented for everyone right now with business travel being down.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, John.
Yes.
And I think something that's not fully understood by people, I know you will appreciate this better than most, but I can disclose these figures because IAG published them, so I'm not giving any secrets away. But IAG published in one of their investor presentations that the contribution to revenue from corporate travel, which is not all business travel, but corporate travel, in the 12 months up to September 2019 was 13.2% of total revenue, much lower than people think. And of that 13.2 from memory, it was 8.7% was in the premium cabins, business and first class, and 4.5% in economy cabins. Now, their total revenue in premium cabins was way in excess of that. They didn't disclose it, but way in excess of that. Interestingly, what we're seeing now is that at IATA, we don't look at the reason for travel, but we look at the cabin.
The cabin of travel.
And if you look at it, actually, premium traffic in premium cabins is recovering faster than traffic in economy cabins. And as a percentage of total traffic, it's at the highest I've seen it. I've looked back over several years. It's at the highest we've seen it. So we are seeing a lot of people traveling in premium cabins. I think a lot of these people are traveling for leisure, premium leisure. Consumers have accumulated quite a bit of money through this pandemic because they had nothing to spend it on. And there's clear evidence that people are prepared to spend for that premium service. And actually that segment of the market, I think, is doing particularly well. Will business travel recover? No doubt. Everybody hates Team and Zoom. Maybe the people who invented it love it, but I hate it. You don't get the same experience.
No,
you and I
looking eyeballing somebody.
It's just not as good. So yes, it worked well for us. It enabled us to continue to do business through this pandemic. But we've all now recognized that it's a poor imitation of a proper face-to-face meeting. So I was pessimistic about the recovery in business travel, corporate travel, I'm much more optimistic about it now. And, you know, everybody knows chief financial officers are the meanest people in the world.
I was going to say the bean counters want to cut the travel.
You know, and these people, you know, were always looking to keep the
travel budget
under control. So, you know, the idea that they had no control over it prior to this pandemic and they're now only now exercising control, that's a nonsense as well. So I think we will see a recovery in corporate travel. It clearly will lag. And I think the main reason it will lag is because businesses have a duty of care to their employees. And while, you know, the risks of sending somebody away for them to get caught away from home because of a border closure, I think that's playing on
more of a driving
decisions
factor.
much more than the financial aspect. And I expect that you know, we'll see relaxation in that, and we're seeing it in domestic markets.
Yes.
U.S. domestic market, which has recovered to where it was in 2019. But if you listen to the CEOs commentating on the,
they're very bullish.
Yeah. So again, based on what I'm seeing, I think all of the evidence available to us suggests that you know, this segment of the market will recover. But interestingly, premium travel is recovering faster than economy, and that's largely down to the fact that there's you know, growing demand for this premium leisure segment.
I think it really is a very interesting development for the future, and as you said, many airlines are reporting. I think all the Gulf carriers, I've spoken to all of them recently, they've all said their seat factors and their average ticket revenues in the premium cabins are higher, all three of them, than pre-pandemic. And as you said, I think there is this leisure segment, which if it sticks there and it's not just a flash in the pan for the post-pandemic, it should be an important part of the future.
Well, I can comment that, you know, when I was at British Airways in 2008, 2009, that segment, that premium leisure segment, remained quite robust through that economic downturn.
Right.
So it does tend to be a segment of the market that is robust through economic cycles. It clearly will have some impact, but not to the same degree as other segments.
One other big topic, Willie, outside of the challenges of wars and pandemics, is one which is not going to go away, and you've been on the case, so to speak, since your time at IAG, is the environment, where the industry is inevitably in the spotlight. There are big challenges for the industry to meet its requirements. You and IATA led the way by going for net zero as an agreed strategy since last year by 2050. But the practicalities of large aircraft and long-haul aircraft in particular using hydrogen or electric, you know, I don't know where they are, theoretically maybe 50 years away. So we have to find other means, short-haul or very small aircraft much sooner we could do that. But sustainable aviation fuels, which are now the words which people are using more, which produce less carbon emissions through the life cycle of food production, seem to have to be the way forward. Are you optimistic we're going to get enough? Because people say, oh, it's too expensive, or there's not enough of it. But I think you certainly personally have quoted that there's a massive interest. Airlines are snapping up what's available. Can we get there quick enough with that to make a big difference?
I believe we can, and we have to. You know, this issue must be addressed.
Yeah.
I was really pleased that the industry came together to agree net zero 2050 at the IATA AGM last year. And it wasn't easy, you know, because not every airline, I think every airline appreciates the challenge, but I think a lot of airlines are frightened by the cost of that challenge, but they recognize that it's something that we must do. I'm absolutely confident that we can do it. I'm getting more and more bullish about technology than I have been. But you're quite right. You know, if we look at it statistically, we know that about 80% of the industry's CO2 comes from long-haul travel, flights of more than 1,500 kilometres. And we're not going to see an electric, hybrid electric or hydrogen solution to that segment for some considerable time. So that's why when we sort of presented a path to net zero in 2050, we saw that element of technology playing only a very small part. We see the significant contribution, particularly in the latter years, coming from sustainable aviation fuel. Today, sustainable aviation fuel is about 2.7 times the price of jet kerosene. Now, partly because jet kerosene has gone up in price, so the differential has come down. But it's still, you know, a significant premium. And yet, as you've heard me say, the industry bought every single drop of sustainable aviation fuel that was available last year. Every single drop of it we acquired. And in fact, many airlines would have bought more had it been available. So the issue is not to convince airlines that they need to use it. The issue is that we need suppliers to produce it. And I'm not talking about the likes of Neste who are, producing sustainable fuel, and it's great to see them. But, we need the traditional oil companies producing sustainable fuels. They've made huge profits from this industry over the years. We now need to see them put their
reinvest.
Yeah, they are the problem. The problem is not the airplane. The problem is the CO2 produced by the fuel. So they need to be part of the solution, and we need to see these companies invest more and starting to seriously ramp up the production of sustainable aviation fuel. And we should see the premium reduce. I don't believe we'll get to equal prices, other than you will see jet kerosene increase as the demand reduces the cost of, we'll get into the diseconomies of scale that we're seeing.
Producing kerosene.
Yeah, that we're seeing today. So part of the problem with the high price for sustainable fuel, it's being produced in very small volumes. So we need to see significantly increased production, which I've absolutely no doubt we will see, because there's huge demand. The demand exists, and if people are still looking for signals that the airlines are going to buy it, they're blind, because the signals have been there for years. What they need to do now is, have belief in their own product and recognize that airlines will buy sustainable fuel when it's made available to them.
And we've seen, some governments have incentivized it. I believe the USA is doing quite a lot of work. Again, is this an opportunity, given where we are today, maybe the EU to show more leadership and put similar incentives in place, or, dare I say, the UK government to do more to encourage it?
We are seeing, the US has been particularly positive about the incentives for sustainable fuels. We're seeing it in Japan. We are seeing it in several other countries. The EU beginning to do it. The UK has actually done some good things in this area. And I think there's good reason for governments to provide incentives and support in the same way as they provided it for biofuel for road transport, which is still significantly greater challenge than in terms of the amount of CO2 it produces. But we know that there's much easier technology solutions for road transport than there is for air transport. But the governments have provided a lot of financial support to incentivize like biodiesel and biofuels for road transport. They should be doing the same for air transport as well.
And what about governments? Again, we're here in Europe, a major European economy. More practical things that could be done now, like CESAR, Single European Sky, Air Traffic Control. I see the smile already coming to your face, Willie. This has been talked about for decades, and there has been work done, but we're woefully short of what could deliver massive savings on fuel burn today, even with no change in technology on aircraft engines.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, airlines have already spent the money to fit the technology in the aircraft. There's nothing stopping airlines operating in an environment where you fly from A to B. In fact, that was one of the positives around this pandemic. We were doing that.
Yes.
We were flying from A to B without following these crazy
circuitous routings.
And the reduction in CO2 with a single European sky is somewhere between 10 and 12% of CO2. So it's a scandal. This is a political scandal. So you've had the debate here in France, force people to travel by train. Now I came by train from Geneva today. It was late. The Wi-Fi useless. It didn't work. There was, very poor service on board. So, but trains work from time to time. But if Eurocontrol did a great paper on this. If you removed every single flight in Europe of less than 500 kilometers, which is typically the ones that they believe should be replaced by rail. And that's assuming that there was a rail alternative, which there isn't in many countries, Ireland being one where there's no real domestic rail service, but to get off the island of Ireland, you're not going to use a train. But if you replaced every single flight in Europe of less than 500 kilometres, you would reduce the number of flights by 24%, but the amount of CO2 by 3.8%. So, that's not the solution, particularly when you think that you could reduce CO2 by 12% if these politicians, the same ones that will lecture us about what we should do, if they just pushed through what's within their control and agreed on the single European sky, that would be a 10 to 12% reduction in CO2 in Europe. It's a scandal that it's not done. There's no cost to it. There's no technology impediment to it. Airlines have been calling for it for years. We could do it. It would be beneficial for Europe. It would be beneficial for our consumers. There's no reason why it shouldn't be done other than the politicians can't get their act together.
I guess that's something you're lobbying about on a daily basis to try to get the penny to drop.
But I think I go back to what I said. We need to call out these politicians when they talk rubbish. We need to point to the facts. Facts are important in this debate, particularly when it comes to the environment. You have to have people talk honestly and base their comments on the reality and the facts. The idea that we will solve the problem of CO2 in Europe if we force people onto trains is nonsense. It's not going to be the solution. And then you've got the environmental impact of high-speed trains. Noise is a much bigger problem for trains than it is for land use, much bigger problem. The cost of infrastructure, massive. So, let's have a debate based on the reality of the situation rather than come out with sound bites that, make some of these politicians look good. So, remember the figures. If every flight of less than 500 kilometers was replaced, you'd save 3.8% CO2. Eurocontrol did a fabulous paper on this. The problem is not with flights like these. A single European sky could do twice, 3 times that, and we could do it tomorrow.
Absolutely. Willie, I've had the 3 or 4 minute warning. We're nearly done. Just a real quick one. It's unfortunately a big topic in itself. I mean, the OEMs, the aircraft manufacturers, they've got their share of challenges right now, whether you look at Boeing or Airbus, you as a former CEO and indeed a pilot. How do you view that? I mean, are they going to get through this? Do you think one is doing a better job than the other, or equally both as challenged in their respective ways?
I think they're both challenged. Like I've been dealing with Boeing and Airbus going back to 1998, so 24, 25 years as the CEO. And I've seen them go through cycles. So this is not new. Boeing clearly have more challenges than Airbus at the moment. But, you've got to remember, Airbus had plenty of challenges as well. Think back to the delays associated with the A380.
Mm-hmm.
They have had a lot of problems with even the narrow-body aircraft. So, if you've been in this industry long enough, you will have seen these, these peaks and valleys, and we're just seeing one at the moment. I've no doubt that they will get their act together. I'm confident that Boeing will address their challenges. It's a great company. They produce fantastic aircraft. I am slightly biased in that it was Boeing aircraft that I flew. But we need strong competition between Boeing and Airbus. This industry has suffered at the hands of monopoly, duopoly suppliers for many years, or quasi-monopoly in the case of airports. We need strong competition between Boeing and Airbus. It's vitally important that we see both of these companies succeed, and the same with the engine manufacturers. So, they'll get their act together and they'll sort them out.
Well, interesting to see that one of the last things you could say you bequest to IAG was an MOU you did, which I think was at the Paris Air Show with Boeing for the 737 MAX, and people were debating, will that ever come to fruition once Willie goes? And now it's just been announced. In fact, we got one of the IAG CEOs on the panel later, so I may ask him about that.
Yeah, no, it's. I was delighted because I think it's a great aircraft. I've flown the MAX simulator. I've flown on it as a passenger. I think it's a fantastic aircraft. I think it'll work extremely well for IAG. I wouldn't have signed that MOU, if I didn't believe in it. And it wasn't, Willie Walsh doing it. It was in consultation with the board and the CEOs at the time, including Luis Gallego, who was running Iberia. So, I was really pleased to see Luis finally sign that deal. So it's good news.
Fantastic. Willie, with the last 90 seconds, you've got the annual general meeting of the IATA coming up in 2 weeks' time. Many of the themes we've debated now, I'm sure, are going to be on your agenda, and diversity and more. I guess plenty to talk about when you meet out in Doha in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, no, diversity is clearly very important, particularly at a time like this, going back to what we said earlier. If we're in a a battle for talent. You know, the idea that we still, as an industry, aren't seen as attractive to female employees or potential employees, that's something that we have to address. I'm pleased to see we are making progress. We've seen several female CEOs appointed in recent months. That's good news, but we're still way behind where we need to be. But interestingly, the initiative 25 by 2025 that IATA has been running, we're seeing good progress there and confident that the situation will improve. But you know, diversity is critical for our industry. Diversity is good. You know, without question, all forms of diversity is good for a business. Our industry is no different. We've got to make progress in this. We're fooling ourselves if we don't recognise that there's a huge opportunity for us to be more attractive to women as an industry than we have been in the past. So we have to address this.
Excellent. Well, Willie, it's been a pleasure as ever talking to you today. We've chewed to fat on a number of issues, I think. We look forward to seeing what comes out of the AGM in 2 weeks' time. So, Willie Walsh, Director General of IATA, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.